The dismissal letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November, and Nora Bellamy read it twice at the kitchen table before she set it face down on the scrubbed wood and returned to the range without a word to anyone. She had known, in the way one knows a thing before it arrives, that something was coming. The past fortnight had carried the particular quality of a held breath. Lady Portia Ashworth had been at Clarendon Hall for 3 weeks by then, established in the East Wing with her lady's maid and her opinions. And every morning since her arrival the household had tilted a degree further from the order Nora had spent 3 years maintaining. The kitchens had felt it first. They always did. A great house speaks its trouble through its food long before it speaks it anywhere else. The letter was from Mr. Greaves, the estate steward, and it said that His Grace Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Clarendon, had determined that certain economies were necessary for the coming year, and that the position of cook was among those to be consolidated. Nora's service was valued. A reference would be furnished. She was to vacate her rooms in the staff wing by the end of the week. She stood at the range and stirred the porridge she had already begun and did not allow herself to consider in that first hour what the letter meant or did not mean. There was porridge to finish. There was Thomas's tray to prepare. Because the boy was still recovering from the fever that had laid him flat for a fortnight, and he needed something warm and plain and exactly right. It was only a cook, Lady Portia had said, when Nora had sent word through Mr. Greaves in October that the spice stores were being drawn down at a rate that did not accord with the household size. Only a cook, and not a woman whose accounting of pepper and nutmeg warranted the intention of a duke. The phrase had reached Nora through Mrs. Hobson, the housekeeper, delivered with the careful neutral expression Mrs. Hobson reserved for information she wished to convey while maintaining her own distance from it. Nora had received it with equal neutrality. She had revised the household spice order herself and said nothing further about it. She set the porridge aside and reached for Thomas's tray and began to work. The boy's room was on the second floor, away from the family wing, which suited Thomas well enough. He was 12 years old and the Duke's ward by the terms of a friendship made in the peninsula, and he occupied the curious position of being entirely dependent on a man who did not know how to be easy with children, and entirely devoted to that same man in return. Nora had understood this about Thomas from her first month at Clarendon Hall. She had adjusted every dish she sent upstairs accordingly, because a child who cannot eat is a child who is afraid, and she had set about, quietly and without announcement, making Thomas unafraid. 3 years is a long time to feed a household, longer than most people understand who have not done it. It is long enough to know which days the Duke had not slept, because on those mornings he took nothing sweet and called for strong tea at 6 rather than 7. Long enough to know when the quarterly accounts had troubled him, because he ate mechanically and left food on his plate, without noticing he had left it. Long enough to know when something had reminded him of his late wife Isabel, because on those evenings he did not come down to dine at all, and Nora sent up a small cold supper on a tray and placed beside it always a single sprig of dried rosemary in a glass, because rosemary had been the late Duchess's kitchen garden preference, and the gesture cost nothing and said everything she could not say aloud. She had never been thanked for the rosemary. She had not expected to be. The week she had spent reading to Thomas during his fever, she had done so because Mrs. Hobson had come to the kitchen at 11:30 on a Saturday night to say that the boy was asking for someone, anyone, and the nursemaid had her own sick child to tend. Nora had brought her book and her lamp and sat beside him for 3 nights running, reading until he slept, and then sitting a while longer to make certain his breathing had steadied. She had not considered it a sacrifice. It was simply what was needed, and she was the person who could provide it. She had not known, any of those 3 nights, that the Duke stood in the corridor outside the door. He had come himself on the second night, meaning to look in on the boy, and he had found the door already slightly open, and the warm amber of Nora's lamp laying itself across the floor, and her voice, low and steady and entirely unperformed, reading something about a man crossing a river in winter. She was sitting in the chair that had been moved to the bedside, her back to the door, her shoulders level and unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world, and intended to use it in precisely this way. The book was held in her left hand and her right hand rested in her lap, open and still. Thomas had been asleep by the 3rd page. Nora had set the book down on the small table beside the boy's bed, and smoothed his hair back from his forehead with one careful hand, the gesture so practiced and so entirely without self-consciousness that the man in the corridor had gone very still. She sat for a moment longer, watching the boy's breathing steady and slow. Then she had picked up her lamp and her book, tucked the coverlet a fraction higher, and returned to the chair at the window, where she sat and looked out at the dark park until she was certain he would not wake. She had not known any of those 3 nights that the Duke stood in the corridor outside the door. She had believed herself unobserved. She had been entirely herself. He had not gone in. He had not said anything to her about it the next morning. He rarely said anything directly to her. The household understood that His Grace communicated his approval through the steward and his displeasure through silence, and Nora had operated within that understanding for 3 years without complaint. She finished Thomas's tray and carried it up herself, because there was no one else free, and because she wanted to see the boy's face when he smelled the porridge. He was sitting up when she came in. His color was better. He ate nearly the whole bowl. Stay with this story a little, if you will. There is more to see, and the thing that mattered most had not yet been understood by anyone except, perhaps, the woman carrying the empty tray back down to the kitchen. The formal dining room at Clarendon Hall ran the length of the south wing and in November received the afternoon light at an angle that turned the tablecloth the color of old cream. Nora had looked at that tablecloth from the service door 1,000 times. She had known, by the quality of the light on a given day, how the meal was going, how the conversation sat in the room, whether His Grace was present in any genuine sense or merely occupying his chair. She could read the room through its sounds as well, through the particular rhythm of cutlery on china, the intervals between voices, the long silences that meant either excellent food or very poor conversation or both. Lady Portia Ashworth had arrived 3 weeks earlier, in a traveling carriage that was considerably larger than the household had anticipated, accompanied by a lady's maid, a personal footman, a small and ill-tempered dog, and 6 trunks of belongings that suggested she intended to stay considerably longer than the fortnight the Duke had been told to expect. She was his aunt by marriage, the widow of his father's younger brother, and she had, in Nora's considered professional estimation, the temperament of a woman who had never been told no in any room she was confident she owned. She had begun rearranging the household's rhythms within 48 hours. The dinner hour was moved. The drawing-room fires were built higher and earlier than the staff could reasonably sustain. She had called for a particular wine from the Selliser that Nora knew, from the ledger, did not exist in the current inventory, and when Mr. Greaves reported this, Lady Portia had fixed him with a look of such composed incredulity that the man had gone back to the cellar twice more, as though the wine might have appeared in the interval. Nora had watched all of this from the kitchen, with the attention of a woman who has learned to understand a household from its foundations up. She had said nothing. She had adjusted the menus to account for the additional covers, and the altered hour, and the heightened expectations, and she had done it without complaint and without requesting additional staff. Because she was a practical woman, and because complaint, in her experience, rarely improved a kitchen's output. It was in the 3rd week of Lady Portia's visit that the matter of the spice stores had arisen. Nora had gone to Mr. Greaves directly, because a shortfall in the pepper and the nutmeg and the dried ginger was not a thing a cook invented, and because the quantities consumed did not correspond to any meal Nora had produced, or any occasion she had been informed of. Mr. Greaves had taken her note and carried it upward through the household's hierarchy, and from there it had reached Lady Portia, who had translated it into a critique of Nora's accounting and dispatched it back down. Only a cook, Lady Portia had said, in the privacy of her own sitting room, was not a woman whose inventory concerns warranted the Duke's time. Only a cook ought to manage her stores better before troubling the household above stairs with her arithmetic. Mrs. Hobson had conveyed this to Nora in the kitchen passage, her voice very even, her eyes directed at a point on the wall somewhere to the left of Nora's head. Nora had thanked her. She had revised the order herself and recorded the discrepancy in her own ledger without presenting it to anyone. She set the matter aside like a pan moved to a cooler part of the range. It would be needed again. She would know when. Lady Portia held her first formal luncheon of the visit on the Thursday of that week, 4 days after the dismissal letter. Nora's replacement had not yet arrived. She was therefore still in the kitchen, still producing the meals, because there was no one else to do it, and she was not a woman who left a household without its food simply because the household had elected not to keep her. Miss Cecily Vane attended the luncheon. She was 22 years old and the granddaughter of the Earl of Sherborne, and she had been seated at the Duke's right hand with a deliberateness that made her position at the table legible to every person in the room. She was fair and pleasant, and she laughed easily, and Lady Portia's gaze moved between Miss Vane and the Duke with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has placed a piece well on a board. His Grace, from what Nora understood of the meal's progress through Mrs. Hobson's report, had been polite and present and entirely unreadable, which was, Nora reflected, simply how he was. The soup course came up from the kitchen at precisely the right temperature. Nora had made it herself, a clear consommé with a precision of seasoning that had taken her 18 months to calibrate to the household's taste. She heard, through Mrs. Hobson, who reported it that evening without quite meeting Nora's eyes, that Miss Vane had said, at the table, that she had never tasted anything so good from a kitchen of this size, and that Lady Portia had smiled and said brightly that it was very fine work for only a cook, and that a woman of Miss Vane's future position might expect a great deal more, of course, once the kitchen was properly arranged. The phrasing was light and assured, and it named Nora's category and dismissed it in the same breath, as one might remark upon a serviceable piece of furniture before describing the one intended to replace it. He had said nothing. He had set down his spoon. Nora learned this detail later. At the time of the luncheon, she was in the kitchen, preparing the remove, and she was thinking, with some part of her attention, about the recipe card in the pocket of her apron, where she had put it that morning for the comfort of having it near. It was a small, stiff square of paper, written in her mother's hand, for a sauce that nobody made any longer and that Nora had never been asked to produce at Clarendon Hall. Her mother had been cook at Summerfield Park for 23 years, and the card was the last thing she had pressed into Nora's hand before Nora had taken her first position. The ink had faded to the color of a winter afternoon. She had memorized the contents years ago. She kept the card for the handwriting. She touched it through the apron fabric once while the remove was plating and returned her attention to the kitchen. The Duke came down to the kitchen the following morning. This had never happened before in the 3 years of Nora's service. He descended the back stairs at 7:15 and stood in the kitchen doorway, his coat not yet on, and said, in the flat level voice he used for statements rather than questions, that she was to remain in her position and until his arrangements were settled, and that she was not to trouble herself about the letter from Greaves. Nora was at the range. She did not turn around immediately. She was aware of exactly where he was in the room without looking, the awareness a precise and uncomfortable thing like a change in the air pressure before a storm. "Your Grace is very kind," she said, which was what she said when she did not know what else was safe to say. "I am not kind," he said. "I am practical. Return to the kitchen." She was already in the kitchen. She did not point this out. He went back upstairs. She stood at the range for some time, after she heard his footstep on the stairs, her hand steady on the pan handle, her pulse distinctly not. This was the first of 2 such moments, and she misread it as entirely as she had misread every other evidence of his attention. She had told herself for 3 years that a man like him, cold and specific and deliberate in all things, did not notice the woman who produced his meals. She had told herself this because it was the only version of the situation she could afford to believe. She did not yet know what Mrs. Hobson would tell her in 3 days' time. She did not yet know about Isabel. The housekeeper came to her on a Sunday afternoon, when the kitchen was quiet and Nora was working on the week's accounts. Mrs. Hobson sat down across the table without being invited, which was not her habit, and folded her hands on the wood, and told Nora the story she had carried for nearly 4 years and had never told anyone in full. The late Duchess of Clarendon had been ill for the final 6 weeks of her 3rd confinement. Not dangerously ill, the household had believed, or had persuaded itself to believe. The housekeeper at the time, a woman named Stafford who had since retired to Bath, had made a series of small decisions, each reasonable in isolation, each intended to protect the household from the Duke's displeasure at bad news, each one incrementally delaying the summons that might have brought him back from London in time. The physician had been consulted twice and had said the word manageable on both occasions, and Stafford had chosen to hear manageable as certain. The footman dispatched to London had been sent with a letter that described the Duchess as resting comfortably, which was true on the day it was written, and not true in the days that followed. The child had not survived. Neither had Isabel. Edmund Ashworth had returned to Clarendon Hall to find both of them already laid out. He had stood in the hall, still in his traveling coat, and had looked at the housekeeper, and the housekeeper had not been able to hold his gaze. He had sat in the library for 2 days. He had emerged and run the estate with perfect competence ever since, and he had not trusted a single report he received from anyone who served him, because the people who served him had, in the one moment that mattered, managed his feelings rather than told him the truth. Mrs. Hobson set down the portrait miniature she had been turning in her hands throughout the telling, a small oval frame that held a woman with a serious face and careful eyes. She placed it on the table between them. She put it away herself, before she took to bed, Mrs. Hobson said. Stafford never gave it to him. I found it in the linen press 2 years later. I have not known what to do with it. Nora looked at the miniature. She did not touch it. She sat with this knowledge for a long time, and felt it settle into the parts of her understanding that had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for something to settle there. The rosemary. The cold suppers on the evenings she had sent up without being asked. The absolute precision she had brought to every detail of the household's feeding. Not because precision was required of her, but because she had understood, from very early on, that this house had been managed around its master's feelings, rather than according to its actual condition, and she had set about, dish by dish and tray by tray and season by season, correcting that, not through words, through the only language the kitchen had. She had fed him the truth for 3 years, the truth of the estate's real condition, in the quality of the provisions she sourced or refused to source. The truth of Thomas's health, in the plainness or richness of the boys' meals. The truth of the household's morale, in the complexity or simplicity of the staff's suppers. The truth of his own grief, in a sprig of dried rosemary placed beside a cold supper on the evenings she knew he would not come down. She had not done it consciously, not with that articulation, but she understood it now with great clarity, sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts open in front of her. He had dismissed her without understanding what she was. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the wall for a while. Then she looked at the miniature. The serious woman in the oval frame looked back at her with the expression of someone who had, in some other era of things, also told a difficult truth and found no one prepared to hear it. Nora reached out and moved the miniature gently to the side of the table, near the window where the light was better. It seemed, at least, that it should be somewhere it could be seen. Lady Portia brought the matter to its crisis on a Tuesday evening, exactly a week after the dismissal letter. She summoned Nora to the formal dining room, not through Mrs. Hobson, not through the steward, but through a direct instruction delivered by the lady's maid, which was a deliberate violation of the household's order of address, and which everyone in the staff wing understood to be intentional. Mrs. Hobson intercepted Nora in the kitchen passage before she could go up. She stood with her back to the wall and her voice low, and she said, in the careful neutral register that meant she was conveying information she had not sought and did not wish to be responsible for, that Lady Portia had been telling her guests at tea that afternoon about the irregularities in the kitchen accounts, and that she had described Nora to a Mrs. Fenwick and a Lady Alderton as exactly the sort of woman one found in a neglected household, someone who had elevated herself by degrees above her proper function and required correction. Only a cook, Lady Portia had said, who had been permitted too long to believe herself something more. Mrs. Hobson reported this, and then looked at the kitchen wall and waited. Nora said, "Thank you, Mrs. Hobson." She was entirely still. She felt the weight of the week, of the 3 years before it, settle into her shoulders like something finally acknowledged. She was a cook. She had always known what she was. What she had apparently not known was how much that category was resented by those who had discovered it, could not be used to dismiss everything she had done within it. She straightened her apron and went upstairs. The dining room held 12 people at its center table, and 11 of them were guests Lady Portia had gathered for the week. Miss Vane sat at the far end, her expression composed and carefully pleasant, her hands folded in a way that suggested she had been told to expect something and was waiting for it to begin. Lady Alderton, a gray-haired woman with the expression of someone thoroughly enjoying themselves, occupied the chair beside her. Mrs. Fenwick was at the side Mr. Greaves stood near the corridor door with the resigned posture of a man who had been told to witness something and wished very much he were elsewhere. Lady Portia stood at the head of the room, and she was holding a sheaf of papers that Nora recognized with a cold clarity as the household accounts from the past quarter. Lady Portia said that certain irregularities had been discovered in the kitchen's expenditure, and that she required an explanation from the source. The kitchen's expenditure was not irregular. Nora knew this with absolute precision. She had managed it herself, and it was, if anything, significantly more efficient than it had been under her predecessor. She said so in the careful level tone she used when she needed her voice to be a wall rather than a window. Lady Portia said that she supposed one could not expect a better accounting from only a cook. The room was very still. Nora said, "The accounts will bear examination, my lady." He entered from the corridor door. He had not been expected. He stood for a moment in the doorway, his gaze moving across the room with the precision of a man who has walked into a scene and understood it immediately. His eyes came to rest on Nora, and in them she read something she could not yet name, something careful and specific that she had not seen before and did not know what to do with. Then his gaze moved to Lady Portia, and what she saw there was cooler and much more legible. "Do not go into Lady Portia," he had said, the week prior when this confrontation had first been threatened. "I will speak with her." She had not gone in. He had, apparently, not been sufficient. Lady Portia had assembled an audience and tried again. He crossed the room. He took the accounts from his aunt's hand without asking for them and without haste, in the way he did everything, as though the possibility of resistance had not occurred to him and therefore did not exist. He examined the first page in silence. The room was very quiet. Mr. Greaves at the corridor door had gone so still he might have been furniture. Lady Alderton set down her glass. Miss Vane's hands remained folded in her lap, and she had directed her gaze to a point on the tablecloth. He examined the second page. He set the accounts on the table. "These are in order," he said, Lady Portia said, with the particular brightness of a woman whose confidence has not yet registered the change in weather, that she had had her own man look over them, and that he had found the figures for the spice stores quite inconsistent with the household size, and that she had only wished to ensure that his grace was properly served, which was, after all, her duty as a member of the family to attend to. He said, "They are consistent with my preference. I requested the reduction myself." This was not true. Nora had managed the reduction herself. In October, when she had noticed the stores were being drawn on at a rate she could not account for and could not yet prove. The Duke had said nothing to her about spice stores in 3 years. She stood very still and understood, for the first time, the full weight of what he was doing. He turned from Lady Portia and looked at Nora directly. It was not how he usually looked at her. Usually his gaze passed through the room, and she was furniture in its path. This was a different kind of looking. It was the looking of a man who has finally read something correctly and is confirming that his reading is accurate. "Miss Bellamy," he said. She waited. "The accounts are yours?" "Yes, Your Grace. They reflect accurately the household's condition?" "To my knowledge, yes." He nodded once. He picked up the accounts and handed them to Mr. Greaves, who had come forward from the corridor door with the quiet efficiency of a man grateful to have something useful to do, and said, "File these with the other quarterly records." He turned back to the room and gave it a moment of his silence, the way a man surveys a field before he says what needs to be said about it. Lady Portia had recovered enough to try again. She said, with the particular cadence of a woman attempting to reclaim ground she has already lost, that she had only wished to ensure that his grace was not being ill-served by the staff he had retained, and that given the questions around the accounts, she still felt it prudent that a woman of Miss Vane's considerable household experience might be consulted going forward, as the position of Duchess required a particular standard in all things, and that she had only his well-being in mind in saying so. The dining room was very quiet. He looked at his aunt for a long moment. She met his gaze with the confidence of a woman who has never, in her considerable experience, been publicly overridden in a room she considers her own. His face was, as always, still as stone over a river. Then he turned to the assembled guests, and his gaze moved to Miss Vane, and he said nothing to her that was either rude or unkind. He said, with the level precision he used when he wished something to be final, that he was grateful for her company at Clarendon Hall and hoped her stay had been comfortable. The sentence was complete. It left no room for addition, Miss Vane understood. She lowered her eyes. Her hands lay still in her lap. He turned back to the room and drew one breath and said what he had come in to say. "Miss Bellamy stays," he said. "And she has my trust entirely." 9 words, quiet as a key turning in a lock. The silence after them was of the particular kind that follows something irrevocable. Lady Portia's chin lifted a fraction. Her mouth opened and closed once, and then once more. The fragment of a sentence that had no longer anywhere to go. The bright social assurance draining from her expression in stages, like color from a cut flower. Lady Alderton looked at her glass. Mrs. Fenwick directed her gaze to the tablecloth with the careful focus of a woman who has understood what has just happened and intends to remember it. Lady Portia sat down. Mrs. Hobson, standing near the service door, made no expression at all, and her right hand, which had been gripping the door frame, released it. Nora stood very still and felt the room change around her. This was the same room where 3 years of Tuesday evenings had played out from the service door, where she had read the household's condition and the quality of the light on a tablecloth, where Lady Portia had first said the words "only a cook," with the effortless certainty of someone naming a category that contained everything that needed to be said. The room had not changed. She had not changed. The verdict had. He did not look at her again in the dining room. He spoke briefly to Mr. Greaves about the accounts, and then to Lady Portia in a voice too low for anyone else to hear, and Nora watched, from across the room, the careful subsidence of his aunt's expression. The degrees by which a woman who has been certain all her life arrives at the recognition that certainty has limits. It was not a cruel process. He was not a cruel man. He said what he said, and he stopped when enough had been said, and he allowed Lady Portia the dignity of retreating on her own terms, which she did, with considerable composure, and which Nora thought very well of her for managing. He allowed the guests to settle back into their places. He was, to all appearances, entirely composed, the cold, precise man he had always been, the man who ran his estate with the accuracy of a mechanism that had learned not to trust the reports it received. She went back to the kitchen. She did not know what else to do, and the kitchen was where she understood herself best. He came to her there at 9:30, after the house had quieted. The staff had gone to their rooms. The range held its warmth, and the kitchen smelled of the day's bread and a faint edge of wood smoke, and the clean, particular smell of cold November air through the window latch. She was at the work table when she heard his step on the back stairs, and she stilled, and then she made herself continue doing what she was doing, which was nothing in particular, the straightening of things that did not need straightening. He stood in the doorway in the same way he had stood the week before, except that this time she turned around. He was holding the recipe card. She did not understand how he had it. It must have fallen from her apron pocket somewhere in the evening, somewhere in the dining room or the corridor or the stairs, and he must have found it, and she felt the small cold exposure of a thing she had not meant to share. It was a private thing. It was the one private thing she had carried into this house, and into every room of it for 3 years, and it was in his hands. He held it out to her. She crossed the kitchen and took it. Their fingers did not touch, but the air between them in the moment of the card's transfer was very particular. She had been aware of every inch of him from across the room. She was aware of considerably less than an inch of him now, and her pulse was entirely unreliable. "Your mother's," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." He looked at the card in her hand. She looked at the card in her hand. The ink was faded to the color of a winter afternoon, and the handwriting was her mother's, precise and slanted, the script of a woman who had done things carefully and believed that care was its own argument for a person's worth. "She was a cook," he said, "at Summerfield Park for 23 years. A pause. The range crackled. Outside the kitchen window, the November dark pressed against the glass, and the first snow of the season had begun to fall, not heavily, just enough to whiten the stone sill and soften the edges of the kitchen garden beyond it. "I did not read your mother's hand," he said, "but I read yours for 3 years. She looked up at him. He said carefully, as a man says something he has worked out and is saying for the first time, and does not intend to have to say again, "The rosemary." She did not move. "The evenings I did not come down," he said. "You sent the cold supper. There was always rosemary. It was Isabel's." The kitchen was very still. "I thought it coincidence," he said. "The first time. The second time I thought it a habit of the household, something carried over from before. By the third time I knew it was not coincidence, and I did not know what to do with that knowledge. And so I did nothing with it. which is what I do when I do not know what to do. He paused. It is, I am told, a quality that can be improved upon. She thought it was possible he had just made something almost like a wry observation. She kept her face level. I dismissed you, he said, because my aunt wished me to, and because I had not found a reason to resist her, and because I have not, in 4 years, found a reason to resist anything. I had forgotten that reasons existed to be found. He paused again, the pause of a man choosing words with the care he gives to everything. You are the reason I found, she said very quietly. You should have found it sooner, Your Grace. His mouth moved. It was almost something. Yes, he said. I should have. He did not leave. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time, and she stood near the range with her mother's recipe card in her hand. And the snow continued to fall outside the window, and neither of them said anything further that evening. They did not need to. The kitchen was warm, and the fire was steady, and the space between them was no longer the space of a duke and his cook. It was something else entirely. It was something that had been accumulating, dish by dish and tray by tray, and evening by evening for 3 years, and had only now been spoken. The late Duchess's portrait still hung in the library. He still visited it on certain evenings, though less often now, and when Thomas had once asked him who the lady was, he had said, his voice low and entirely steady, that she had been a woman he loved and had not protected well enough, and that this was a thing he would carry, and that carrying it did not mean it was all he would carry. Thomas had thought about this for a moment, and then asked if there would be biscuits with supper. There had been biscuits with supper because Nora had made them, and they were exactly right. By the following spring, the household at Clarendon Hall had arranged itself into a new order that was quieter and steadier, and less expensive than the one that had preceded. It and Lady Portia had found the atmosphere at Clarendon altered in ways she could not quite articulate, and had decided that her own house in Bath required her attention. Miss Vane had accepted, by February, the attentions of a very agreeable baronet, and the household had wished her well with complete sincerity. Mr. Greaves had noted in the estate ledger that the kitchen's quarterly accounts were, again, the most accurate and efficient in the household's records, and he had filed this observation with the same care he gave to everything, because it seemed to him a fact worth preserving. Thomas had entirely recovered from his fever by December, and had taken to spending his afternoons in the kitchen, where he was tolerated and occasionally put to work, and where he had discovered that he was passably good at pastry if watched carefully and corrected firmly. The recipe card lived, after that November evening, in the small drawer of the writing table in the kitchen's anteroom, the drawer where Nora kept the things she did not wish to lose. She did not hide it. She simply kept it where she could find it. On the morning that he finally said, with the quiet precision of a man who has worked out exactly what he is asking and exactly what it will cost, and has decided the cost is right, that he would like her to consider whether she might be willing to manage his household in a capacity considerably more permanent than a cook's position, she was at the range, and she did not turn around immediately. She stood for a moment with her hand on the pan handle, her pulse entirely unsteady, and looked at the small square window above the range where the April light was laying itself across the stone sill. Then she turned around. He was standing in the doorway in the way he always stood in doorways, and he was watching her with a directness she had learned, only gradually and at some cost, to read correctly. She said, "You should know that I will always tell you the truth, Your Grace." "Even when it is inconvenient," he said. "Yes, that is precisely why I am asking." The recipe card was in the drawer in the anteroom, and outside the kitchen window the April light was warm on the stone, and the kitchen smelled of bread. And Clarendon Hall was quiet around them, in the particular way of a house that has at last settled into something true. She told him yes. Thank you for staying to the end. If Nora's kitchen and the truth she said on the table each evening found something in you, leave a word in the comments. Stories like this one are waiting, and so are we.